It was the summer of 1942, and the North African desert stretched endlessly, a barren wasteland under a cruel, scorching sun. The sky above was cloudless, an unforgiving blue, as the engines of war roared through the dust. The sounds of tanks rumbling, artillery cracking, and engines humming filled the air, but nothing could prepare the enemy for what was about to happen. At 1:15 p.m., in the sweltering heat of the Libyan desert, a single-engine biplane, barely more than a speck in the vast sky, descended with deadly precision. Below it, a column of German Panzer IVs moved slowly along the winding desert road, unaware of the tiny predator circling above. As the schoolteacher turned pilot aimed his sights, the world seemed to stand still. With a sharp pull of the trigger, a small bomb fell from the plane, crashing into the lead tank. Within moments, the air was filled with smoke, fire, and the scent of burning metal. The tanks, once giants of war, were now reduced to smoldering husks. Their armor no match for the unexpected attack. This was not the work of a trained combat pilot, nor was it part of a grand Air Force strategy. It was the audacious, almost absurd, triumph of a schoolteacher from England, a man who had traded in his chalkboard for the cockpit of a tiny, modified plane. Flying a Fairey Swordfish, a biplane once intended for naval reconnaissance, this unlikely hero was about to change the course of warfare in a way no one had anticipated. His target was not just tanks, but the very idea that aerial combat had to come from high-flying bombers or massive fighter jets. The attack, though small in scale, would have enormous consequences, shaking the very foundations of what was possible on the battlefield. The small, underpowered plane, piloted by a man who had no formal military training, would forever change the way the Allies fought the war. By the time the schoolteacher, Flight Lieutenant John O'Brien, began his mission over the desert, the tide of World War II had already begun to turn in North Africa. The Axis powers, led by the infamous Erwin Rommel, were sweeping across the continent, seemingly unstoppable. Their forces were advancing from Libya towards Egypt, aiming for the Suez Canal, a critical link between Europe and the Middle East. The British Eighth Army, under General Bernard Montgomery, was reeling from defeat after defeat, desperately trying to hold back the seemingly invincible Afrika Korps. In the summer of 1942, the Allies were in disarray, facing both a manpower shortage and a severe lack of air support. The battle for North Africa was poised to decide the fate of the entire Mediterranean theater as the war progressed. The Axis forces quickly dominated the desert terrain, their tanks, especially the mighty Panzer divisions, leaving destruction in their wake. To combat this, the Allies had relied on conventional air forces, but the results were often less than decisive. The British Royal Air Force, RAF, had long been outgunned, and the aircraft they used were often outdated or ill-equipped for the scale of the desert conflict. Larger bombers, like the Bristol Blenheim or the Vickers Wellington, lacked the speed and agility to effectively target moving armored units, while the RAF's fighter planes struggled to make a significant impact against Rommel's formidable forces. Despite their best efforts, the RAF could not keep up with the growing German momentum. But all of that was about to change with a single man and a small, fragile plane. O'Brien's journey to becoming a tank hunter was nothing short of extraordinary. A schoolteacher in civilian life, O'Brien had never dreamed of flying, let alone becoming a key figure in the battle to stop Rommel's advance. He was an unlikely candidate for the RAF, yet he had volunteered early in the war, determined to contribute to the fight against the Nazi threat. His skills, however, were not those of a fighter pilot or a bomber commander. Instead, O'Brien had been trained as a reconnaissance pilot, a role far removed from the drama and violence of frontline combat. His plane of choice, the Fairey Swordfish, was an aging biplane designed for reconnaissance missions, with a top speed of only 120 miles per hour and no advanced weaponry to speak of. It was a far cry from the sleek, powerful fighters of the day, but it was precisely this underestimation of the Swordfish that made it so deadly. In the vast expanses of the desert, where larger, faster planes were often less effective, the slow-moving Swordfish could slip in unnoticed, striking with deadly force before anyone had time to react. Armed with just a handful of bombs and a machine gun, O'Brien's weapon was unconventional, yet incredibly effective in the right hands. It wasn't the size or power of the plane that mattered. It was the element of surprise and the relentless determination of its pilot. With his small plane circling above, O'Brien had the advantage of speed and maneuverability, able to outwit and outflank tanks and infantry with precision. The battle for North Africa was as much about the terrain as it was about the technology. The vast desert, with its swirling sandstorms and endless stretches of open ground, offered little cover for the enemy. O'Brien and his fellow pilots quickly realized that the terrain could be used to their advantage, using the dunes and mountains to hide their approach, launching their attacks from unexpected angles. Their planes, while antiquated, were nimble and able to strike where the enemy least expected. The effectiveness of these tactics became clear in a series of successful raids on German armored columns, each time hitting their targets with surgical precision, crippling Rommel's supply lines, and forcing the Axis to rethink their strategy as the months passed. O'Brien's small band of pilots would take on the role of tank hunters in a way that no one had ever imagined. Their mission was not just to harass the enemy, but to cripple the very heart of the Axis war machine, their armored forces. With every successful mission, the Allies gained momentum, and the myth of the invincible Axis tank began to unravel. By the time the Battle of El Alamein arrived, the RAF's tank hunting operations had helped turn the tide of the battle in favor of the Allies. Rommel's once mighty forces were now on the defensive, and the British Eighth Army began to gain ground. O'Brien's tiny plane, piloted by a schoolteacher who had no business being on the front lines, had become one of the most unlikely and successful weapons in the war. The question now was not whether the Allies could win, but how much further their innovation could take them. The war was not over yet, but the impact of this small plane, piloted by an ordinary man, had proved that the impossible could be achieved, even against overwhelming odds. O'Brien's exploits would become legendary, but the true scale of their impact would not be fully understood until years later, when military historians would look back on the unlikely tank hunter who had changed the face of warfare in North Africa. And as the desert sky darkened with the promise of another raid, the soldiers below could only wonder, what other unexpected weapons did the Allies have waiting in the wings? As the summer of 1942 drew to a close, a transformation was taking place in the Allied strategy in North Africa. What had started as a desperation tactic, unconventional, almost absurd, was rapidly becoming a cornerstone of the Allied war effort. The small, slow-moving Fairey Swordfish, a plane once considered obsolete, had become one of the most feared weapons in Rommel's Afrika Korps. The Germans, who had long prided themselves on their technological superiority, could hardly comprehend the damage being inflicted by these tiny biplanes. In the face of their well-armored tanks and mechanized divisions, a schoolteacher's plane was making them reconsider everything they thought they knew about aerial combat. The key to the Swordfish's effectiveness lay not in its size or speed, but in its adaptability. It wasn't a state-of-the-art fighter nor a sophisticated bomber. What it had instead was a nimbleness that larger, more advanced planes lacked. With its wide wingspan and slow speed, the Swordfish was perfect for strafing and precision bombing in the wide-open expanse of the North African desert. For a pilot like John O'Brien, who had learned the art of quick thinking and improvisation, the Swordfish became a weapon of sheer versatility. It could drop a single bomb with pinpoint accuracy or unleash a flurry of machine gun fire, tailoring the attack to the target in front of him. The Swordfish became a symbol of the innovation and resourcefulness that defined the war effort for the Allies. Yet, even as the Swordfish proved itself in the field, its effectiveness was still largely underestimated by both the Axis and the Allies themselves. The RAF was scrambling to keep up with the demands of the campaign, and its resources were limited. The aircraft themselves were aging, and their engines were often underpowered. The Swordfish was, after all, a relic of a bygone era, designed for reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare, not tank hunting. But as the war continued, it became clear that the British and Commonwealth forces, facing an adversary that seemed to possess an almost unbreakable will, could not afford to be selective about their tools of war. They would need to make do with whatever they had, adapting it to the task at hand. One of the first significant advantages that the Allies had in this unconventional campaign was the element of surprise. The Axis forces, accustomed to fighting large, mechanized units supported by highly organized air forces, were ill-prepared for the guerrilla-style attacks carried out by O'Brien and his fellow pilots. When a tank convoy, escorted by Panzers, moved across the desert, the small biplanes could strike quickly from above, often without warning. The fast-moving German convoys would never know what hit them. The Swordfish, moving at barely 120 miles per hour, could fly low enough to avoid radar detection, coming in from unexpected angles. It could fire off a round of machine gun bullets before disappearing into the haze, leaving the enemy stunned and vulnerable. Each attack served to demoralize the Germans, sowing confusion and fear as their heavily armored vehicles were knocked out of commission one by one at the power of the Swordfish's strike. Though, lay not in brute force, but in its precision. Unlike larger bombers, which required long preparation times and precise bombing runs, the Swordfish could swoop in quickly, drop a single bomb, and then disappear back into the sky. This type of hit-and-run tactic, which made use of the aircraft's small size and agility, proved devastating to the enemy. As the months wore on, the RAF began to refine its approach, with pilots like O'Brien perfecting the technique. Their targets weren't just tanks, but the infrastructure that supported them: supply lines, fuel depots, and maintenance workshops. When these were taken out, the German tank divisions began to falter. Unable to keep up the pace of their advance, to fully understand the impact of the Swordfish's success, it's essential to look at the technical aspects of the aircraft itself. While the Fairey Swordfish was far from a cutting-edge design, it was equipped with a surprisingly effective arsenal. The biplane was powered by a single Bristol Pegasus radial engine, which gave it a top speed of 120 miles per hour, slow by modern standards, but fast enough for the desert environment. Its wingspan of 40 feet allowed for exceptional maneuverability, making it capable of quick turns and rapid altitude changes that could help it avoid enemy fire. The plane was equipped with both bombs and machine guns, an unusual combination for such a small aircraft. This adaptability allowed the Swordfish to attack ground targets, including tanks, with a level of precision that larger bombers couldn't replicate. The bombs themselves were also carefully selected for their ability to damage armored targets. The RAF used 250-pound bombs, which, when dropped from a low altitude, were able to penetrate the armor of even the toughest Axis tanks. These bombs were often carried in small numbers, allowing pilots to conserve their payloads for strategic strikes. Unlike other bombs, which relied on sheer explosive force to inflict damage, the 250-pound bomb used by the Swordfish was designed to punch through armor and cause significant internal damage. This made it perfect for tank hunting, as it could incapacitate even the heavily armored Panzer IVs without needing to rely on a direct hit. But the true brilliance of the Swordfish's design came from its ability to evolve. While the German military was locked into its reliance on larger, more powerful weapons, the RAF had learned to make do with what they had. The Swordfish was a perfect example of this. With its small size, it could be deployed quickly, arriving at the battlefield faster than many of the more advanced aircraft that the Germans relied on. It could fly low enough to stay out of radar range, allowing it to strike without warning. And, importantly, it was cheap and easy to produce. In contrast, the German Panzers, though formidable in their own right, were difficult to replace when lost. This advantage proved crucial in the Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, when O'Brien and other Swordfish pilots took part in the Allied counteroffensive. Rommel's tanks, heavily armored and formidable, were no longer invulnerable. As the Axis forces retreated, the RAF pilots followed, raining bombs on their fleeing tanks, preventing their escape and inflicting heavy losses. It was a brutal reminder that even the mightiest war machines could be brought down by the smallest of aircraft, those that adapted and struck where the enemy least expected. The Axis, after suffering blow after blow, began to realize that their tanks were not as indestructible as they had once thought. The Germans had believed their superior armor would protect them from the Allied threat, but they were wrong. The Allies had found a new way to fight, one that combined precision, speed, and unexpected tactics. And at the heart of this shift was the unlikeliest of heroes, a schoolteacher's tiny, unassuming biplane. As the battle for North Africa wore on, the story of the Swordfish's success spread throughout the theater, and the Allies began to understand something crucial. Sometimes, in war, it was not the strongest or most powerful weapons that prevailed, but the ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast the enemy. And in the face of Germany's might, it was a small, outdated aircraft and the determination of its pilot that would become one of the greatest successes of the North African campaign. As the war raged on into 1943, the significance of the Swordfish's unlikely success began to reverberate far beyond the North African desert. The small biplanes that had once seemed like little more than relics of a bygone era had transformed into a symbol of the evolving nature of warfare, one that was less about sheer power and more about adaptability, precision, and innovation. The tank hunting tactics pioneered by John O'Brien and his fellow pilots struck a profound psychological blow to the Axis forces, who had long believed in their technological supremacy. The desert was their battleground, their steel giants charging across it with the full weight of Nazi ambition. But now they found themselves hunted by an enemy they could neither understand nor defeat. For the Axis, it was a new kind of terror. It wasn't just the destruction of their tanks, but the unraveling of their belief in invulnerability. For decades, the German military had relied on the power of their armored divisions, their Panzer tanks seen as the ultimate weapon, an unstoppable force that would dominate any battlefield. But the relentless strikes from the low-flying, slow-moving Swordfish had shattered this myth, leaving the German commanders bewildered and frustrated. How could these flimsy biplanes, with their outdated design and underpowered engines, pose such a threat to their supposedly superior machines? As tank after tank was destroyed, the Germans began to realize that no amount of armor could protect them from the ingenuity of their enemies. Psychologically, the impact was far-reaching. German tank crews began to fear the skies in ways they had never anticipated. The Luftwaffe, once seen as the dominant force in the air, was now faced with a new kind of enemy, one that didn't rely on speed or firepower but on patience and precision. The Swordfish pilots would come in low, often in the heat of the afternoon, when the sun was at its peak and visibility was poor. They would strike with deadly efficiency, taking out fuel depots and repair workshops, which further crippled the German tank divisions. Rommel, who had once been the embodiment of military genius, began to question the limits of his armored forces. "The desert is no longer ours," he reportedly said after one particularly devastating raid. "We have lost our grip on it." For the British and Commonwealth forces, however, the success of the Swordfish was more than just a tactical victory. It was a symbol of resilience and innovation. The fact that a schoolteacher, with little more than a rudimentary understanding of warfare, could bring down one of the mightiest war machines in the world was a testament to the power of resourcefulness. The Swordfish was not just a weapon. It represented a shift in how the Allies would approach the war. As more pilots took to the skies, more tank hunting planes were built and deployed, each one armed with the lessons learned from O'Brien's early raids. The success of the Swordfish inspired an entire generation of fighters, bombers, and ground forces who would follow in its wake. But on the ground, the effects were equally profound. As Rommel's tank columns began to falter, so too did the morale of his troops. The Germans had been accustomed to the unyielding confidence that came with their superior technology, but now they found themselves fighting an enemy that could strike anywhere, at any time. A series of interrogations conducted by the Allies after the war revealed that German soldiers were frequently demoralized by the constant threat from the skies. The constant attacks from the air made it impossible to sleep. One soldier wrote in his diary, "Every time we moved, we expected to be bombed, and every time we were bombed, we lost something: men, tanks, or ammunition." The psychological toll on the German leadership was equally significant. As the war continued to drag on, Rommel's confidence began to wane. In reports to Berlin, he spoke of the difficulty of maintaining his forces' cohesion in the face of Allied air superiority. Even more troubling for the Germans was the growing realization that their tanks were not the unstoppable force they had once believed. Instead, they were vulnerable, just like any other weapon. The bombing raids on their supply lines and repair depots were just as damaging as direct strikes on the tanks themselves. The German military command was forced to reassess their entire approach to the North African campaign. They could no longer rely on their armor alone to win the war. They needed to adapt, and quickly, or risk losing the entire region. For the Allies, the impact of the Swordfish raids was nothing short of transformative. As the Axis forces retreated, the British and Commonwealth forces began to gain ground, and the balance of power in North Africa began to shift. In many ways, the success of the Swordfish raids marked the beginning of the end for Rommel's forces in the desert. The Battle of El Alamein, fought in October 1942, became the turning point of the campaign. While many factors contributed to the eventual Allied victory, the attacks on German supply lines and tank divisions played a critical role in weakening Rommel's forces. Without the constant threat of Allied air attacks, the Germans would have been able to mount a more organized defense. But the Swordfish and other aircraft ensured that their supply lines were cut off and their tanks rendered useless. The legacy of the Swordfish raids, however, was not confined to the North African campaign. The success of these low-tech, high-impact missions provided a blueprint for future aerial warfare. As the war continued into Europe, the lessons learned from the Swordfish raids would be applied to other theaters of combat. The idea that smaller, more agile aircraft could target specific weaknesses in the enemy's infrastructure and armor became a cornerstone of Allied air strategy. The effectiveness of the Swordfish demonstrated that air superiority was not just about overwhelming firepower, but also about intelligence, adaptability, and precision. In the years following the war, the story of the Swordfish became one of legend. A schoolteacher, armed with little more than a small biplane and an unwavering sense of duty, had taken on the might of the German Panzer divisions and won. O'Brien's success proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the human element, creativity, resourcefulness, and determination could still change the course of history. His actions would be studied for years to come, serving as a reminder that, in war, it's not always the size of the weapon that matters, but the size of the will behind it. As the world moved into the post-war years, the lesson of the Swordfish remained clear: never underestimate the power of the unexpected, for it is often the smallest forces that make the biggest impact.